This is the secret door in the basement. I've built a wall in our basement that's divided our new family room and our new storage room. And I'd like to have a door in that wall so that we can get back to the storage room. Now, this won't be the only access to this area. You can go around the chimney and through the bedroom and into the same space. The door will be at one end of the wall, and it will swing into the storage room. I would like to have it look like the shelves and the detailing that's on that wall on the family room side. So the shelves will continue and the drawers on the bottom will continue onto the door. I had some early ideas for the way this door could work. One being to have the entire wall swing into the storage room, which would have been kind of neat, but difficult with the computer and the TV riding on that wall. Another idea was to have the wall move in and out, sort of like the way storage containers in museums work, where you have cabinets that are on tracks and you can move the cabinets around and compress the circulation between the cabinets. But this seemed like a lot of work for not a whole lot of space gained. So I ended up going with something that was more the size and scale of a regular door. Now, the construction of the door and the structure for the door is similar to the wall in that it's a frame with studs. I got it as straight and as flush and as square as I could, and I put in a few screws to hold it together. Then I measured from corner to corner to make sure it was square, and it was very close, but not quite exactly perfect. And as this was going to be the door and it was going to move and it was going to have to fit into its space, I wanted it to be as square as I could get it. So I got out a big clamp to pull the two corners that were slightly further apart together. And it was only like 1/8 of an inch or maybe 3/16 of an inch. It wasn't very much. And I checked to make sure things were square. Once I had it where I wanted it, I put the rest of the screws in. Now, the door has been working fine, but in looking back on it, I think building the frame out of built-up pieces of plywood or even inexpensive hardwood might have been a better option, as it would have been more stable. 2x4s tend not to be dried as much as they really could be, and they tend to move a little bit over time. But so far the door has been fine. I put it in place to see if it was going to fit, and it was fine. I put the hinges on. Because I have the plywood on the front face, I can overhang that over the end of the wall and the side of the door. So I didn't feel I had to mortise the hinges into the 2x4 frame. I just attached the hinges directly to the surface of the 2x4s, which doesn't look very professional, but for what I'm doing, it works just fine. I found with hanging doors, I like to add only as many screws as I need, which is usually only one on each hinge. Then make sure the door is swinging and closing and in the right place. Then I can add the rest of the screws. Because this door was going to have a lot of extra weight on it with the shelves and the drawers, I thought I should add a wheel to the outside of the swing of the door. And my first idea was to put that wheel on the family room side of the door, because that's where the weight would be with the shelves and the drawers. So I made a quick sort of scrap wood wheel holder to go on the front of the door, and it seemed to work just fine. I added a little bit of an angle to the wheel so that it would be perpendicular to the axis to the center of the swing, if that makes sense, so that it would roll on the floor correctly. I wanted to test as well to make sure the wheel was going to contact the floor similarly through the swing. My fear was that it would be up high at one end and too low at the other end, but it seemed to be just fine. The other thing I was realizing at this point was that I was going to need some kind of handle and latch mechanism for this door. That wasn't going to be an off-the-shelf thing that I could use. So I had a little bit of an idea at this point of what I wanted to do. So I cut a slot into the frame of the door that I could use later for the latch mechanism. I could start putting the plywood on the family room side of the door at this point. I started to cut those pieces out. I made a short but very straight 2x4 that I could use as a ledge for the piece of plywood that's going to go on the door. And before I attached that, I marked where the slot in the door frame was, and I could cut that hole into the plywood as well. That piece of plywood can go on the door. I wanted to hide the screws for the plywood behind where the shelves would be going on the door. So I had to measure and locate where those screws were going to go. And to put the lower panel on, I had to take my makeshift wheel off. And I was beginning to rethink the location of the wheel at this point as well. And I can put the lower panel on. This panel was a little more straightforward. I just had to shim it off the floor and locate where the screws were going to go. In a previous video, I showed and talked about how I did the framing for the drawers, and I'm going to do the same thing on the door. So I need to put a piece of frame on the door panel, then make the vertical supports for the drawers. And I can use my same story stick to get the width of the drawers the same as the other drawers for the 2 drawer support panels. And I can finish out the frame under the countertop piece. I can cut the top for the bottom shelf. So this is the big piece of glulam beam that will go on the top of the drawers and will be the wider bottom shelf. I can sand that. And I can attach it the same way that I did with the walls, where I drilled through from the family room side, then put the shelf in place. Then I can drill through from the storage room side and then bolt that shelf to the door. So this is putting the bolts into the shelf. And doing this, I can straighten out the door with the structure of the shelf. So the seam between the shelf and the door is perfectly tight. What's a little bit odd about this door, among a bunch of things, is that there really isn't a frame that the door sits in. So in order to have a stop for the door, to have something for the door to close against, I need to build a fin on the end of the door that will sort of reach out and stop against the column that frames the entire wall system. I made a spacer piece to take up the bit of plywood that's sticking out beyond the frame, and this will put the fin in the right location to hit the column in the right place. And I'll make the fin piece out of more of the 1/2-inch fir plywood that makes up the walls. It just so happened I had a scrap piece that I could cut in half, and I could get the width I needed out of those to make the vertical section along the door. I also wanted to put a piece of trim at the edge of this piece of plywood, basically edge banding the plywood. So I made a 1/2-inch square piece of fir that I can glue and pin nail to the edge of the piece that makes up the fin. So I made 2 of those. Now I can cut those to the right length and attach them to the door. So I sort of clamp the door in the location that I wanted it to be closed in. then I could put these pieces up against the column and the door and screw them in place. So it's a little bit like the door frame, or the part that looks like the door frame actually moves with the door. But the door now has something to stop against. The basic form of the door is now complete, and I want to start working on the shelves. The first shelf is going to have the handle and the latch mechanism built into it. So I need to build the first shelf before I can put up the other shelves. And before I cut into my first shelf, because I only have one chance to modify that shelf, I wanted to make a prototype. So the idea is that a wood-turned bowl will sit on the shelf, and it will just appear as though there's a bowl sitting on the shelf. And you rotate the bowl, and that moves a mechanism through the shelf and the door that opens the latch for the shelf. So I'm going to cut out a piece of the shelf. Within that, there's going to be a Lazy Susan bearing and a little paddle-shaped piece that's basically a circle with an arm on it. And the bowl will sit on that paddle-shaped piece. So I'll cut out the shape of that paddle into the shelf, and I'll make a space for the bearing, and I'll make holes so that you can access the screws for that bearing. So you can see how that bearing sits in the hole, and the paddle piece sits on that bearing, and you can see how it moves here. So I think that's my prototype piece. And it seemed to work. What I learned from doing the prototype was that it really helped to make a spot for the bearing plates to fit into so that the paddle will fit centered in the shelf cutout. Trying to hold it centered and put the screws into it, keeping it centered, was almost impossible. So if there was a cutout in the wood that held the bearing and the two pieces in the right location, that really helped. So now that the shelf is cut, I can make the paddle armature piece. So I cut it to the right thickness, and I cut the spot for the bearing, and that fit. And then I can cut out the shape. And there's a little hole at the end of the arm to attach to the rod that's going to take the movement of the bowl down to the latch. I can clean up the parts with some sanding. Now to work on the bowl. So I needed a bowl that was about 9 inches in diameter. Nothing too big and nothing too fancy. And I found a walnut blank that I had first turned probably 10 years ago. That's been sitting and waiting to be finished. So I flattened the bottom. Now something to notice here, a safety thing to notice here, is that I'm moving the bowl with the grain across the joiner head. If I rotated this 90 degrees and tried to do this, it would explode and make a giant mess, and I would probably get hurt. I can attach this with a faceplate to the lathe. Start making it round again. It's dried and misshapen just a little bit. And once I have the outside close, I can do the rim and start working on the inside. Something I wanted to do that was a little bit different with this bowl was to have the rim be a little thicker on the inside. So the form of the outside would look sort of normal, if you can say that. And then the inside would be thin lower down, but at the rim it would be a little thicker. So it would be a little bit like a handle. So it would look like a bowl, but then when you touch it to move it as a handle, you feel that shape that fits into your hand. I wanted the bottom to cover the paddle armature piece, but I still wanted the bowl to look like it was sitting on the shelf. So I left the bottom flat and I brought up the outside of the bottom up just a little bit. So the center will sit on the moving piece in the shelf, but the outside of the bottom of the bowl will act a little bit like trim and cover that and still be very close to the shelf and make it look like the bowl is just sitting on the shelf, but also allow it to move freely. I can scrape the outside and inside to get the finish ready for sanding. Then I can sand. And as usual, the outside went really easily and the inside was a pain. But it all went fine and I put finish on it. So usually I use some kind of oil, but because this is going to get some use, I used polyurethane. It's the same finish that's on the shelves. And I put finish on the armature piece. And I then remembered that I wanted to take off a little bit of the height of the arm section so it will fit in that slot that's in the door. And the bowl is dry now, so I can take that off the lathe. And I got the armature centered on the bowl and drilled some well-placed holes. Then I can clamp those two pieces together and screw the base armature piece onto the bowl. Then I can attach the bearing into the shelf cutout, and the bowl and armature will fit into that. With that working, I can attach the bearing with some screws. Then I can clamp the bowl to the shelf. I've got a block of wood in the bowl, so this will sort of work. With the cutouts for the bearing, it holds this whole assembly in the right location. I can attach the bearing to the bowl assembly, and everything is attached now. There's a spring on the underside of the shelf that will hold the latch in the shut position. I really had to think through which side the spring had to go on so that it would pull the latch in the right direction. So this shelf will go up the same way that the other shelves go up, where I drill through from the front of the door, put the shelf in place, then bolt the shelf from the back. Now at these upper shelves, as I couldn't clamp them as well, I would drill a smaller hole and put 2 screws in, and that would hold the shelf in place well enough to do the bigger holes and the bolts for the shelves. Once that first narrower shelf was done, I could then do the other 3 shelves, and those were straightforward, as there weren't any cutouts or work that needed to be done on them. I could use the same spacers I had for the shelves on the main part of the wall. I could clamp the shelf on the door tight to the shelves on the wall, and then clamp the shelves together at the outer nose of the shelves, and then screw and bolt the shelf to the door. So that's what it looks like with the shelves in place. And the door basically looks like what it's going to look like. I still need to put finish on it. Now I need to build the mechanism to take the movement of the bowl around to the latch to hold the door in place. The thought was to have a rod running along the back side of the door, and I would make 2 pegs that would attach to that rod, then sit in the holes of the arm and the rocker on the latch. So I'm basically taking a threaded rod and giving it 2 pegs, or 2 little nubbins. I did the first one round, and then I decided it'd be nice to have a place for the washers and the bolts to bear on, so I made a flat side on each of these peg pieces. Now you can see how this all sandwiches together. It's a bolt, washer, the peg piece, and then a washer and a bolt. And this allows me to change the length of this rod because it's threaded. I need a hole in the frame of the door running from behind where the bowl is over to the outside of the frame of the door, where the latch will be. And with the threaded rods and the attached pegs, I could make a much smaller hole because the peg piece doesn't have to go through the frame. When I was first thinking about this, I was thinking this would all be out of wood and I'd just make it as a piece. But then I was thinking about it, and I would have to have giant holes in the frame to fit the end through. So this way I could sort of build the piece up within the frame. Now that the rod is in place and working, I can make the latch and the little rocker arm. I made a prototype, and it seemed to work. I went ahead and cut everything out of a nice piece of maple. and cleaned the pieces up and got everything to fit. I cut a piece of dowel that I had for a pin, and I drilled some holes to attach part of the latch to the door. This piece will hold the little rocker arm for the latch. One thing that I wasn't really thinking about was that I made the pin and the rocking arm removable, but that ended up being really useful as I ended up remaking the arm, I think 3 times to get the shape right. So it made it nice that nothing was really attached. It's all just sitting there, held together with gravity. So you can see how the little rocking arm works. And the pin, I just found a round piece of wood that I had, and I attached that to the top of the pin, so the pin won't fall through, and you can just set it in place. I think the key in this was making everything adjustable, so that I wasn't remaking parts, I was just changing lengths and shapes. So now I can put the rod together and kind of figure out where the little rocking mechanism is going to go. I figured out roughly what the length of the rod should be and cut it. This was a little harder than I thought it was going to be. I was worried maybe it was hardened steel and it was going to damage the cutters, but it seems to be okay. I used a bolt that was on the rod to thread off of the rod and clean the threads up from the cut. So at this point, it seemed like it was going to work, but I was going to have to open the door to be able to attach these pieces to the door. So I was going to finally have to really make the wheel work on the door. As I had the end of the door supported on wedges on the floor to keep some of the stress off the hinges with all of the weight on it. So I built sort of a quick stacked wedge out of some plywood. And once that was together, I could sand the edges and sides. And I drilled holes through it for bolts so that I could bolt this wedge to the end of the door. So it worked in the end where there's a space on the floor and a space next to the door between the column and the chimney to fit this little system for the wheel. So in the end, it made sense to have the wheel on the end of the door. So I moved my wedges around a little bit, and you can see how the wheel's going to fit into its little space. Now, because it's a wedge, I had to find a whole bunch of different lengths of bolts. So I probably have more bolts than I really need, but they're not very big. I think they're only 1/4-inch bolts. But it seemed like it looked better if there was a bolt on each step. And it seems to work, and the door opens. Now I can attach the latch mechanism to the door. So what's nice is this all just fits together and I can replace parts as I need to. And it seems to move when you rotate the bowl. And I can adjust where that attachment from the rod to the rocking arm is based on the bolts on the threaded arm. I can attach the latch plate, I think is what you would call this. When I first made this, I made an adjustable piece for where the latch would attach to the plate, but even my adjustment wasn't high enough. So I took all that off and I cut my slot a little taller. And I sanded some of the corners down. And even in doing this, it would close and it would latch, but you'd push on the door and it would just open. So the latch wasn't really holding the door shut. So it looked like it was working, but it really wasn't working. And you had to move the latch out of the way to close the door, which didn't make any sense. You really want to just be able to close the door and have the latch kind of self-latch. So I remade another latch plate that didn't have the adjustability, but it had the point at which the latch contacts it in the right place. And I remade, I think, 3 different little latch arms with different shapes for the hook. And the hook kept getting smaller and smaller. down to just what it needed to work. And in the end, I have it where you can pull the door shut and it will latch and it will hold the door in place. So I think this is my current setup. So now you can walk up to it, rotate the bowl, the latch opens, and you can open the door. And I still need to work on the ceiling in the storage room so I don't have cable running in the way. And it still needs finish. And the last really big thing is to build the drawers. Thanks for watching.